There is a specific kind of grief that has no name in English. The Japanese call it mano no aware, the ache of things passing. The Portuguese call it saudade, a longing for something you are not sure ever existed. But neither of those quite captures what the families on the shore were feeling, because their particular grief was the grief of not knowing. Not knowing if the men were dead. Not knowing if they were alive. Not knowing which grief to choose. A boat had left. It had not come back. The sea had taken it somewhere, and had not yet decided what to return. For 14 months, the families waited. For 14 months, 5 men on a small open fishing vessel experienced something that the human mind was not designed to sustain. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the thirst, not even the deaths when they came. The thing the human mind was not designed to sustain was the horizon. The same horizon. Every morning. Every evening. In every direction. Unchanged. Unbroken. Offering nothing. Taking nothing. Simply present, in the way that indifferent things are present, completely, and without acknowledgement. 2 men came back. 3 did not. And what happened in the 14 months between the leaving and the returning is a story that was documented, investigated, and then largely set aside by a world that found it easier to celebrate the survival than to sit with what survival had required. I am not going to set it aside. Let me tell you who these men were. The boat was a small open fishing vessel, the kind used for coastal and near-shore fishing throughout the Pacific Island region. It had an outboard motor, a modest fuel supply, basic navigation equipment, and no communication system capable of reaching beyond the immediate area. It was not built for the open Pacific. No reasonable person would have taken it there. No reasonable person intended to. The 5 men aboard were fishermen from a small island community. They ranged in age from their late teens to their early 40s. They had fished these waters together, in various combinations, for years. This was not an adventure. It was a working trip, out in the morning, back in the evening, fish to sell, money to bring home. I am going to call them by role, not name, out of respect for surviving family members and for the 2 men who returned, who have largely chosen not to make themselves into a story. The captain, experienced, mid-40s, known on the island as a careful man, not a reckless one. The captain's nephew, late teens, on what was supposed to be a straightforward trip with his uncle. The elder, a man in his 40s who had fished these waters longer than anyone else aboard. The young father, early 30s, 3 children, had nearly stayed home that morning because one of his children was sick. The quiet one, the youngest, 17 years old, who by all accounts said little and observed everything. 5 men. A morning's work. A boat that was never meant to go far. The storm that took them was not exceptional by Pacific standards. It was the kind of weather system that forms quickly in tropical waters, a fast-moving low-pressure system with strong winds and significant wave height. The kind of storm that experienced fishermen in the region knew to watch for and typically had enough warning to avoid. They didn't have enough warning. The storm hit in the early afternoon. The motor, running against wind and wave, burned through fuel at a rate that outpaced their reserves. By the time the worst of the weather had passed, they were adrift. The motor had fuel for movement but not for the kind of sustained running that would be required to reach shore against the current and wind conditions that remained. The captain made a decision. He rationed the remaining fuel. He would use it in short bursts for steering, to keep the bow into the waves when necessary. He would not burn it trying to fight a current he couldn't outrun. He was right to make this decision. It was the correct call given what he knew. What he didn't know was the current. The current that had taken them was the South Equatorial Current, one of the major ocean circulation systems of the Pacific, moving westward at speeds of between half a knot and 2 knots depending on location and season. Consistent. Powerful. And in the area where they found themselves, running westward across thousands of kilometers of open ocean before reaching any landmass. They were not drifting randomly. They were being carried. Deliberately in the way that oceans are deliberate, without intention, but with absolute consistency. They were heading deeper into the Pacific. And they had no way to know it. The first week was crisis management. They inventoried what they had. The catch they had already made that morning: fish, unprocessed, enough for several days if rationed carefully. Fresh water in a small tank aboard, enough for perhaps 3 days at normal consumption. Fuel. Basic tools. The clothes they were wearing. No flares. The flares were kept in a storage box on shore, restocked before longer trips. This had not been intended as a longer trip. No emergency beacon. These were not standard equipment for near-shore fishing in their community at this time. No radio capable of reaching shore. They signaled passing vessels in the first days using reflective surfaces, a mirror, the polished metal of equipment, and by shouting and waving when any distant shape appeared on the horizon. Nothing came close enough to see them. The captain organized the water. 1 cup per man per day, divided morning and night. Less than medical recommendations for basic survival. Enough to function. Barely. They caught rain when it came. The Pacific in this region generates rain regularly, and they caught it in everything that could hold water: the fuel containers once emptied, their shirts wrung out, cupped hands during heavy downpours. Rain was the difference between living and not. On the days it rained well, morale was something. On the days the sky stayed clear, morale was something else. They fished. They were fishermen. They knew how to read water, how to make lines from available materials, how to identify the patterns of fish movement by surface behavior. They ate what they caught, raw, because they had no consistent means to cook, and raw protein is protein regardless. The first week ended with 5 men alive and moving west. The second and third weeks are where the story becomes harder to tell. Not because of what happened externally. Because of what happened internally, in the silence between 5 men on an open boat with nothing to look at but each other and the horizon. Conflict in survival situations follows a pattern that is well documented in survival psychology research. The first phase is cooperation. Shared threat produces shared effort. The second phase, which typically emerges between days 10 and 21, is friction. Small irritations compound. Sleep deprivation degrades the emotional regulation systems that normally filter reaction from response. Hunger makes everything sharp. Proximity makes everything unavoidable. The captain held structure. Daily routines, fishing rotation, water rationing, watch schedules for passing vessels, gave the day's shape. Structure is the tool that survival leaders use against the psychological disintegration that open-ended uncertainty produces. If there is a task, there is a now. And a now is more manageable than a when. But structure requires buy-in. And buy-in, on week 3 of an open Pacific drift with no sight of land and no sign of rescue, is not automatic. The young father struggled most visibly in this period. He had 3 children. He had almost stayed home. He had made the decision to go, and that decision was now costing something he could not calculate but could feel with complete precision every time he looked at the horizon. The quiet one, 17 years old, said almost nothing. He fished. He took his watch. He ate what was given. He watched the others with the particular attention of someone who has understood that observation is its own form of participation. The elder told stories. Long stories, slowly told, about the islands and the water and the things his own father had taught him. Not to entertain. To fill the silence before the silence filled them. The first death came on approximately day 31. I am not going to tell you which man died first. The families of the men who did not return have not authorized any public account to specify the sequence or circumstances of the deaths in detail, and I am going to respect that. What I will tell you is what the survivors described about what death meant on that boat. They could not bury him. There is no burial at sea on an open fishing vessel in any way that the word burial usually means. What they could do, and what they did, was maintain the forms of dignity available to them, which were few, but which they used completely. They sat with him through the night. The captain, in what the survivors described as one of the most important decisions he made in 14 months, insisted that they talk about the man who had died. Not around him. About him. Who he was. What he had done. What he had given to the people who knew him. The captain had understood, or intuited, or simply known from somewhere deep in his experience of what it means to be human in a community, that grief requires an object. That grief without acknowledgement does not disappear. It transforms into something that eats from the inside, that turns 5 men on a boat into 5 solitudes. They talked. They remembered. They let the grief be grief. And then in the morning they kept going. Because there was nothing else to do. The Pacific between them and any landmass is a distance that resists comprehension when you try to hold it in a single thought. Let me try to make it concrete instead. The distance between the eastern Pacific island chains and the western Pacific island groups where a current like the South Equatorial eventually deposits its cargo is roughly comparable to the distance between London and Karachi. If you drove it at highway speed, without stopping, it would take approximately 3 weeks. They covered it in 14 months. Drifting. Occasionally steering with the last of the fuel, now used in drops and seconds, to correct course when the current threatened to push them away from the shipping lane they had identified as their best chance. Shipping lanes are not highways. Vessels do not pass on a schedule. The sighting of a distant ship, and there were sightings, across 14 months, perhaps a dozen moments when a shape appeared on the horizon large enough to be a vessel, was an event of such concentrated hope and subsequent despair that the survivors, when they came to describe these moments, used language that reached for dimensions beyond simple emotion. The ships did not see them. An open fishing boat, low in the water, without flares, without a radio capable of reaching vessel frequencies, visible in calm conditions to the naked eye from perhaps 3 kilometers, invisible in any chop at all. Each time a ship appeared and did not stop, something recalculated in each man. Not hope, exactly. Hope is too light a word for what you carry across 14 months. Something more structural. A load-bearing belief about the relationship between effort and outcome. The captain watched his men recalculate. He recalculated too. But he did not let them see it. The second and third deaths came across the middle months. Again, I will not specify the individuals or the sequence. What I will tell you is that by the time 3 of the 5 men were gone, what remained on that boat was not what had left the harbor. Not because the 2 remaining men had become different people, but because they were carrying what the other 3 had left behind. The memories. The last thing said? The specific weight of being the one who continued. Survivors of group disasters, shipwrecks, plane crashes, collapses, consistently describe the same additional burden layered beneath the physical demands of survival. It is not guilt, exactly, though sometimes it looks like guilt. It is more like debt. A debt to the fact of the other's existence. A debt that can only be paid one way. By making the survival mean something. By coming home. By telling it. The captain said, in one account given to researchers who documented the case, that he talked to the 3 men who had died every day for the remainder of the drift. Not because he believed they could hear him. Because he needed to say things out loud, and because the only people he wanted to say them to were those 3. The quiet one, now 24 months into a journey that had begun when he was 17, fished. He fished every day. He caught what was there. He fed them both. 17 years old when it started. He had never been taught what to do when the world becomes only water and loss and the space that people leave. He learned it the way children learn things when there is no other choice. By doing it. They were found by a passing cargo vessel 14 months and several days after they left. The cargo vessel's lookout spotted them in the early morning, in conditions calm enough that the low profile of the fishing boat was visible at sufficient distance. The vessel altered course. It came alongside. The 2 survivors were alive. Severely malnourished. Both had lost weight that the human body should not survive losing. Their skin, their eyes, their physical condition told the story of 14 months before any words were exchanged. The cargo vessel's captain, in the account filed with the vessel's operating company and subsequently shared with maritime researchers, wrote that when they brought the 2 men aboard, the first thing the captain asked was not for water, not for food, not to call home. He asked the cargo captain to write down 3 names. He said, "Write these names down before anything else, because these are the men who were on this boat, and who need to be remembered, and I need to know that someone else knows their names. The cargo captain wrote the names. The captain watched him write each one. Then he drank the water they brought him. There is an aftermath to this story that is not dramatic and not redemptive in any clean way, and I am going to tell you about it because I think clean redemption is the lie that survival stories most often tell. The two men who returned were celebrated briefly, in the way that extraordinary survival produces brief celebration. There were accounts in regional media. There was a formal investigation by maritime authorities. There were the reunions, which were, by every account available, not the explosions of joy that we imagine when we imagine these moments, but something slower and more complicated. The return of a person who has been in a place you cannot follow changes the relationship in ways that take years to understand. The captain returned to fishing. People asked him why, and he gave different answers at different times. Once he said it was the only thing he knew. Once he said it was the only place the three men still felt present to him. Once he said nothing and changed the subject. The quiet one, no longer 17, no longer quiet in the same way, did not return to fishing. He left the island. He went to a city. He built a different life. He has never given an interview. He has never spoken publicly about the 14 months. The notebook he kept, and he did keep a notebook, a detail confirmed by the cargo vessel's account and by the maritime investigation, has not been made public. It is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, still with him. Wherever he is. Whatever it says. I want to talk about the horizon. Because I keep coming back to it, and I think it is the true subject of this story. Every survival account has a physical challenge at its center. The Sahara has heat. Siberia has cold. The wrong island has isolation. This story has all of those things in versions that are real and serious. But the specific thing that this story has that the others don't, the thing that makes 14 months on an open boat categorically different from 14 months in a fixed location, is the moving horizon. Every day the horizon was there. Every day it was the same. Every day it promised nothing and delivered nothing and retreated exactly as far as they advanced. Philosophers have used the horizon as a metaphor for humans striving for centuries. Always ahead, never reached. On an open boat in the Pacific, it stops being a metaphor. It is just the horizon. Present. Indifferent. Permanent. And three men who looked at it every day for as long as they could did not make it to the end. And two men who looked at it every day for 14 months did. And nobody can tell you with precision what the difference was. Not the researchers. Not the maritime investigators. Not the captain himself, who has been asked the question and has no clean answer. Was it luck? In part. Was it will? In part. Was it the fishing, the daily act of doing something with a purpose, of feeding forward rather than simply enduring? The researchers who documented the case think so. The quiet one's daily fishing, they argue, was not just nutritional. It was existential. It gave the days a shape. It gave the survival a direction. It was the difference between lasting and living. I don't know if that's right. I know that a 17-year-old boy got on a boat for a day's fishing and got off it 14 months later, and that in between he carried more than a person his age should have to carry, and that he carried it in a notebook that nobody has read. And I think about that notebook sometimes. The way I think about the WPA transcriptions in the Library of Congress, and the Pacific Island Girls Journal, and all the other records that exist somewhere, written, complete, true, waiting for someone to decide the world is ready. Maybe it isn't. Maybe the horizon is all some things get. Present. Permanent. Seen only by the people who were there.